My name is Derek. I'm 42 years old. I live in Springfield, Illinois, and I want to share something that happened to me 12 years ago. One night that still gives me chills just remembering. I've read strange stories here on the forum, but I never imagined I'd have something like this to tell. What I'm about to describe isn't something you can easily forget because, honestly, to this day I still don't understand what happened that night. It was a Friday, around 2 in the morning, and I was driving back from a business trip. I remember being exhausted, driving alone on the old 54 highway, which goes through isolated areas surrounded by fields with no lights. The radio in my car was static, so I turned it off. The absolute silence on the road was unsettling, but at that hour, all I wanted was to get home. The sky was cloudy, no moon or stars, and only the headlights of my car illuminated the way. It was the kind of scene you see in movies, but it felt too real. A few miles before the turnoff for Springfield, I saw a man walking on the shoulder. He looked tired, hands in his pockets, head down. It wasn't something you see often, especially at that hour and on such an empty road. I usually don't stop for anyone, but something about him made me hesitate. Maybe it was the fact that he was wearing a thin jacket in that cold, or the strange way he looked at my car as I approached, like he had been waiting for me. Without thinking much, I pulled over. He got into the car without saying a word. When he closed the door, I felt a chill run up my spine. He looked to be in his 30s, had messy hair and a pale face, but what stood out the most was the expression he had, a mixture of worry and fear. Out of politeness, I tried making small talk, asking where he was coming from and where he was going, but he only replied with monosyllables. The silence between us started to feel more and more uncomfortable. He was staring out the passenger window, but every now and then I caught him glancing nervously at the rearview mirror. That's when he broke the silence. Without looking at me, he said, "Don't you feel something strange?" I was caught off guard and just replied with a confused, "What?" He finally looked at me, and it was the first time I noticed how serious his eyes were, like he was dealing with something much bigger than I could understand. "Behind you," he murmured, almost without moving his lips. My heart skipped a beat. By reflex, I looked in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing, just the empty back seat illuminated by the dim light of the dashboard. I started to get nervous. Something about this guy was putting me on edge. He kept glancing at the back seat, but suddenly, he turned toward me and said something that froze me. "You think you're the one driving?" I was confused and scared by the tone of his voice. "What do you mean? Of course I'm the one driving," I replied, trying to sound firm, but my voice came out shaky. He slowly shook his head, like he knew something I didn't, and simply said, "Look again." At that moment I was overwhelmed with fear, but I looked again in the rearview mirror. At first I saw only the same emptiness as before, but then something changed. The light seemed darker, like a shadow had appeared there in the back seat. I couldn't make out a shape, but it was as though something was sitting there, watching me. The air inside the car turned colder, and I felt my body freeze for a few seconds. When I could look away, I noticed my hands were trembling on the steering wheel. I wanted to stop the car, throw the guy out, and drive off, but my legs wouldn't obey. I tried to engage in conversation again, asking who he was or what was going on, but he just looked at me with a serious expression and murmured, "We're almost there." That didn't make sense. He hadn't told me where he was going, and I definitely hadn't driven long enough to reach anywhere. When I looked outside, I noticed the road had changed. There were no more trees, no more landmarks, nothing familiar. I was completely panicked and started to hit the brakes, but the car didn't respond. The pedal was stiff, like it was stuck. When I looked at the dashboard, the speedometer was frozen at 0. The car was still moving, but it seemed like it wasn't going anywhere. I looked at the man, trying to understand what was happening, but he just repeated, "You're not driving." My heart felt like it was going to explode. Everything around me felt wrong. I looked in the rearview mirror one last time, and this time, the shadow in the back seat was clearer. It looked like the outline of a person, but with no face, just a dark silhouette that seemed to pulse as if it were alive. The man beside me started murmuring something I couldn't understand, and when I tried to scream, no sound came out of my mouth. It was as if I were trapped, powerless, just watching it all happen. Suddenly, the man turned to me, staring directly into my eyes. His expression was calm, almost relieved. "This is where I get off," he said, and before I could say anything, he opened the door and got out. As soon as he closed the door, the car stopped completely, and the silence took over. I looked around and realized I was parked at the entrance to my street, as if nothing had happened. The clock on the dashboard showed only a few minutes had passed, but I knew time had not been normal. When I looked in the back seat, it was empty. There was no shadow, no presence, nothing. But the feeling that something had been watching me stayed with me for the rest of the night. I checked the car several times, trying to find some explanation, but everything seemed normal. I never saw that man again, and to this day, I wonder what happened that night. Maybe I'll never find out, but one thing I know for sure. After that night, I've never driven alone at night again. My name is Lucas. I'm 35 years old and I live in Jacksonville, Florida. What I'm about to tell you happened about 8 years ago, but to this day I can't get what happened that night out of my mind. It was a quiet Saturday evening and I was heading back from a nearby town where I had visited a friend. I was a bit tired, but what really made me want to get home quickly was the fact that traffic was empty and the usually busy road seemed even quieter and more isolated that night. It was that typical secondary road, with hardly anyone around, surrounded by tall, dark trees on both sides. I was tired, but not enough to need to stop and rest. The music on the radio was calm, and I was thinking of nothing more than the trip back home. The road seemed even emptier than usual, and I soon realized it was the only one on the path. It was when I passed through a more isolated stretch of the road, where the trees seemed to close in on the street even more, that something caught my attention. I saw a figure by the roadside. At first, I thought it might be a broken-down car or perhaps someone needing help, but as I got closer I saw that it was a man, standing with his head down, looking at the ground. He was wearing a simple shirt, jeans and sneakers. He didn't seem unusual, but there was something about him that made me hesitate. I slowed down as I got closer, and eventually stopped next to him. He raised his head, and with a slow movement, he looked at me. His eyes were tired, but I didn't feel any immediate danger. "Do you need help?" I asked, a bit wary but still with a strange feeling in my stomach. He didn't answer right away, just nodded as if thinking. Then he spoke quietly. "If it's not too much trouble, could you give me a ride to the next town? I have a long road ahead." I figured there was no harm in it, so I opened the door for him. He got in the passenger seat without saying anything else. The silence in the car was heavy, but not in a threatening way, just an unusual kind of quiet. He settled in and once again, he didn't speak. His presence was a little unsettling, but it wasn't enough for me to ask him to leave. I continued driving, trying to ignore the growing oddness in the air. The road ahead was dark, and the only sound was the hum of the car's engine and the soft music playing on the radio. The man next to me still didn't seem bothered by the silence. He sat quietly, looking out the window, and seemed lost in his own thoughts. I, on the other hand, couldn't stop looking at him. There was something about him that I couldn't understand. The way he moved, his posture, it was as though he was here, but at the same time, not really present. Like his body was there, but his soul was somewhere else. I didn't want to be rude and break the silence, so I kept driving, though I started to feel more and more uncomfortable. The road ahead was empty, with no sign of movement other than my car, and the only thought running through my head was how that emptiness seemed to be growing. With each kilometer, the silence inside the car seemed to stretch further, like the air around me was becoming thicker. It was then, when we were almost arriving in the town, that he finally broke the silence. His voice wasn't loud, but the phrase he said caught me off guard. "Don't worry, I am just a reflection." I stayed silent for a few seconds, trying to understand what he meant. It didn't make sense. How could someone just be a reflection? I quickly looked at him, but he was smiling gently, as if nothing strange was happening. What really made me shiver was the fact that, at that moment, I wasn't fully aware of what was going on. It was like the air inside the car had become heavier. I glanced at the rearview mirror. I don't know why, but a strange feeling overtook me. My heart raced. His face was perfectly aligned with mine, and it wasn't just his face reflecting, he seemed to be copying my every movement with a precision that sent chills down my spine. I stopped breathing for a moment. It was like time had slowed down. I glanced quickly at him in the passenger seat, but he didn't seem to care. He was calm, still, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. And still, he smiled. The tension became unbearable. I turned the ignition key and, without thinking, slammed the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. My body was frozen, my heart pounding. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if he was playing some kind of trick or if it was a trick of my tired mind, but his expression seemed too genuine, as if he knew more about me than I did. What did he mean by, "I'm just a reflection"? Did he know something about me? I looked in the rearview mirror once again, and for a moment I saw his face perfectly aligned with mine. But then suddenly, he was gone. He wasn't there anymore. Only my reflection remained. The man didn't move. He looked at me and with that strange smile said, "You noticed now, didn't you?" I didn't know what he meant by that. I looked at him, but he was still sitting there, smiling as if he were waiting for something. He looked out the window, calmly opened the door and walked to the side of the road, the place he had first appeared. He vanished into the darkness of the night without a sound. I stayed still, unable to move, completely immobilized. What was happening? Who was that man? What did he mean with those words? After a few minutes, I regained a bit of my composure and got out of the car, trying to convince myself that it was all just a big coincidence or perhaps an illusion brought on by my tiredness. I looked around, but I saw nothing but the empty road and the dark trees. There were no signs that anyone had passed by, no traces of anything that would explain that strange encounter. I was alone. What happened that night still haunts me. I've never told anyone, because no one would believe me. Every time I think about that smile, I feel the weight of that strange reflection in my chest. The strangest part of it all is that when I thought about searching for him later, I found nothing. There were no records of anyone on that road, not even a similar story in local newspapers. I don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was a coincidence, maybe it wasn't. But to this day, whenever I look into a mirror, I can't help but wonder, is he still there, somewhere, watching me back? My name is Caleb. I'm 34 years old, and I live in Flagstaff, Arizona. What I'm about to tell you happened 5 years ago, but to this day, every time I hit the road at night, I can't help but remember that strange night. It's as if the weight of that experience has never left me. I've tried to forget, but every time I think it was just in my head, one detail or another makes me doubt. At that time, I worked as a sales representative, and traveling was part of the routine. I spent more time on the road than at home, and I generally preferred driving at night. Less traffic, less stress. That day, I was at the end of my trip back from Albuquerque to Flagstaff. It was late, almost midnight, and the road was almost empty. The only company I had was the stars in the clear sky and the sound of my car's engine. It was then that I saw someone walking on the shoulder. It was a woman, holding a small handbag, walking slowly. She looked exhausted, with her hair tied in a messy bun, wearing a coat that seemed too light for the cold night. I confess I hesitated for a moment, but after passing her, something made me stop and reverse. Maybe it was because no one should be walking on that deserted road at that hour. Maybe it was just pure curiosity. When I stopped beside her and lowered the window, I asked where she was going. She smiled, a faint smile, but one that seemed relieved. "I'm trying to get back home," she said with a soft voice and an accent I couldn't place. She seemed normal, just a little tired. Still, there was something about her I couldn't figure out. It was as if she was too relieved that someone had stopped. She got in the car and thanked me, saying her house wasn't far. I smiled back, trying to keep the conversation light, but she seemed more interested in looking out the window. When I asked her name, she replied, "Margaret," almost automatically, as if she were uncomfortable talking more about herself. I didn't press her. The road seemed longer than it should have. The night was strangely silent, and the car radio, which always worked fine, began to fail. A low static filled the stations, as if I were in the middle of nowhere, far from any transmission tower. I tried switching stations a few times, but I gave up when I realized it made no difference. The silence became more uncomfortable than I expected. Finally, when we were nearing the address she had given me, something started to feel off. The place was isolated with few lights, surrounded by trees that seemed even darker in the dark. Margaret looked out the window and asked me to stop the car. "This is where I really lived," she said with a calm that gave me chills. I looked where she pointed, but I didn't see anything. There was no house, just a narrow dirt path leading into the woods. I hesitated. I asked if she was sure, because that place didn't look like a residential address, but she just smiled strangely, opened the door, and got out of the car. I watched as she walked into the dark, slowly, until she simply disappeared into the night. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear a door opening. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. I stayed there for a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened. I turned on the high beams to try to light up the path, but all I saw were the trees swaying in the wind. I decided to turn around and get out of there as quickly as I could. It was only when I got back on the main road that I realized her handbag was still on the back seat. I stopped the car on the shoulder and grabbed the handbag to see if there was anything that could help me understand who this woman was. Inside, I found some common items: lipstick, a small mirror, and a yellowed envelope with an address written by hand. The address was the same one she had given me earlier, but something bothered me. The handwriting looked old, as if it had been written years ago. Still feeling strange, I decided to look up the address online the next day. At the time, it seemed like a good idea, but as I tried to search for information, nothing made sense. The address simply didn't exist. There was no house, road, or property registered at that location. I even tried looking for references on old websites, but the search didn't bring anything up. It was as if that place had never been recorded anywhere. My mind started to wonder if I had been mistaken, but I knew I wasn't. Desperate to understand what was going on, I decided to ask a few people. I asked in a local Facebook group if anyone knew the place. To my surprise, someone replied, saying that decades ago there was a house at that location, but it had been demolished in the 80s after a fire. The story made me even more uneasy. I didn't know what to think, how something so recent seemed to blend with a distant past. What did Margaret have to do with this? The feeling that something was wrong consumed me. I decided to take a step back and try to rationalize the situation. But even so, the more I tried to find a logical explanation, the more something inside me said that it didn't make sense. Why would she give me a non-existent address? Why did she seem so calm, so relieved when she asked me to stop? The idea that it had been some kind of prank or joke never convinced me. As time passed, I tried to put it out of my mind, but it was impossible. Sometimes, while driving alone at night, I felt like something was watching me. I don't know if it was my own thoughts or something else, but the sensation that something was wrong never went away. The mystery of Margaret, the non-existent address, and everything that happened that night was never explained. Maybe I'll never know what happened, but a part of me still wonders who she was, where she came from, and why she appeared in my life that way. Now, every time I drive at night, especially when I pass those deserted roads, part of me expects to find something else. But I know deep down that it's better not to know. Because some things, no matter how much you search, simply have no explanation. And maybe that's for the best. My name is Theodore, but everyone calls me Theo. I am 37 years old and currently live in Asheville, North Carolina. What I'm about to tell you happened about 15 years ago when I was 22. It's something that still haunts me, especially because even after all these years, I still can't fully understand what happened that night. I've never really talked about it with many people, but I think this is the right place to share. At the time, I was going through a rough patch in my life. I didn't have a steady job, I could barely pay my rent, and to be honest, I was just trying to run away from my own problems. I hit the road without any particular destination, just a backpack and the idea of going anywhere that would take me in. Since I didn't have money for a bus ticket or gas, I ended up hitchhiking. It was something I did regularly back then, even though I knew it wasn't exactly safe. After a few hours of rides with different drivers, I finally got one last ride that dropped me off near Greenville, South Carolina. I had a childhood friend who lived there, Max. It had been years since we last saw each other, but as far as I knew, he still lived in the same place, an old house at the end of a dirt road. Max had always been a welcoming person, so I figured he wouldn't mind my unexpected visit. I got to his house around 10 p.m. The place looked just like I remembered. A little rundown with peeling paint and a porch with some loose boards, but there was something off about it. You know that feeling when something isn't quite right, but you can't put your finger on what it is? That's what it felt like. The lights were on, and his car was parked in front, so I knew he was home. When I knocked on the door, Max opened it almost immediately, as if he'd been expecting someone. He looked at me for a few seconds before offering a smile, but it was a strange smile, almost sad. He invited me in, and the first thing I noticed was the smell. The house had the strong scent of old wood, but there was something else, like something decaying. I didn't want to mention it. He seemed uncomfortable, fidgeting with his hands and looking at the floor. After a while, he finally spoke. "Do you still remember that accident?" he asked without beating around the bush. That caught me off guard. I furrowed my brow, trying to understand what he was talking about. I had no idea. "What accident?" I asked, confused. Max stared at me for a long time before sighing heavily, like he was about to say something he'd been keeping for a long time. Then he leaned in a little and whispered, "I was in the back seat of your trip when you forgot what happened, didn't you?" I laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. He must have been joking. "Max, what are you talking about? We haven't seen each other in years. What trip are you talking about?" He shook his head, like he was frustrated, and said, "Theo, you don't remember because you were the one driving that car. You took me, along with." He stopped, like he didn't want to finish the sentence. "You don't remember because you forgot, maybe because you wanted to forget." At that moment, I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't just what he was saying, but the way he was saying it. It was like he was absolutely certain about something that I couldn't even begin to imagine. I insisted, "Max, I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't drive any car, and I certainly don't remember you being with me on any trip." He stood up, clearly irritated. "You think you can run away from it forever? You think you can erase it from your memory? It doesn't work like that, Theo. You know what happened that night." He started pacing back and forth, and I just sat there trying to process everything. "You left me there," he continued, "and I was stuck in that place for years. I only got out because I had to do something no one should ever do." That last sentence gave me chills. I couldn't help but ask, "What place? Max, what are you talking about? Stuck where?" He stopped and looked at me so intensely that I had to look away. "On the road. On that curve. You know where." I didn't know. At least, I didn't think I knew. But for some reason, the way he said curve triggered something in me. A vague memory, like a shadow in my mind. A road at night, headlights, a sound, like something breaking. But that was it. Nothing more. I tried to say I didn't remember, but my voice came out weak, almost a whisper. Max then did something that made me even more uncomfortable. He went to a cabinet in the corner of the room, opened a drawer, and pulled out a photograph. He threw it on the table in front of me and stood still, watching me. The photo was of a car, or what was left of one. The vehicle was completely wrecked, almost unrecognizable, and in the background I could see a narrow road and a curve sign. My heart raced. "I took this picture when I finally got out of there," Max said. "This is what was left after you left me." That didn't make sense. How could he be saying that I left him when he was right there in front of me, alive? I tried to argue, but he just shook his head, as if nothing I said would change what he believed. "You'll never understand because you blocked it out, but it won't go away, Theo. It never will." I couldn't take it anymore. I got up and said I had to go, that I was tired and we could talk another time. Max didn't try to stop me, but as I was leaving, he said something that still gives me chills to this day. "Be careful on the road, Theo. Sometimes the things we forget find a way to catch up with us." I rushed out of his house, almost stumbling down the porch steps. The air outside felt heavier than when I arrived. I walked back down the road, now with a feeling that something was wrong, more wrong than I could understand. And as I walked, I started hearing things. Noises in the woods, like footsteps. I'd look behind me, but no one was there. The footsteps would stop when I stopped, and they would start again when I moved. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if Max was trying to scare me or if there was something more to it. But since then, I can't drive on deserted roads without feeling a chill down my spine. Something inside me tells me there's more to this story, something I don't want or can't remember.